Okay, so I'm glad we didn't have any big problems there. I'm going to speak quite quickly because I know that the guy who gets between a guy and his beers is not very popular. If you don't understand, then please come and see me afterwards. Okay, so let's go. I'm here to talk about the Open Cloud Initiative, which Thomas spoke about briefly. And it's basically a non-profit Australian association. And it was inspired by the success of the Open Cloud Manifesto, which is to say that it was created to clean up the mess. It's modelled after the open source initiative and the open source definition. I'm a Debian developer, amongst other things, so I'm quite involved with open source, and I figured that that cloud needed basically the same thing. Okay. We're going to go through some of the same lessons. So, for example, trademarks being rejected and this kind of stuff is quite possibly going to happen, but that's okay. So the first 6 months we've spent basically talking to people. We've had an open mailing list running for that time. We've been consulting with vendors and users. I spend most of my time dealing with large enterprises, so talking to them about what their requirements are, and also individuals as well. And now that we have something to talk about, we're on to evangelising, spreading the word and so on. That's where we need you guys to help out. Okay, so we've got a few different sites here that you can look at. We've got Drupal, we've got MediaWiki, we've got Google Code, we've got Google Groups. There's some URLs there. We'll make these available for you as well so that you can come and see them later on. And special thanks to Rackspace for hosting all of that for us. And Google, of course. Now, the first thing that we need with Open Cloud is a trademark. So when people hear Open Cloud, they need to know what Open Cloud means. When you hear open source, you know that it has certain freedoms which are protected. We have a trademark application pending, and we also, for the actual words itself, this is a certification mark, so we give them a list of requirements, and then if you meet those requirements, you're allowed to use the mark. Obviously, Open Cloud is a bit generic, so we've got some issues to work through there with USPTO, but we've got a large law firm in the US working on that, and they've been kind enough to volunteer their time, so very happy with that too. This is the Open Cloud logo. It's blue, like clouds. The other one was green because of the open source logo, and they have slightly different meanings for different types of Open Cloud. Okay, so we have the branding, we have the process, which involves the ongoing refinement of the Open Cloud principles, the assessment of products and services against the principles, which is very similar to the way that the Open Source Initiative does it. That is to say, if you have a product or a service that you wish to use the Open Cloud logo with, we start a discussion on a public mailing list, and people map the set of guidelines or principles to your application. Of course, we've got to deal with the enforcement of the trademarks and the education of users as to why it is that Open Cloud is critically important. Now, I guess the main thing that we want to talk about is the principles themselves. And from the discussions, we fairly quickly coalesced around 4 points. The first one is open formats. So we're talking about things like ODF, the actual document formats themselves. These need to be of an open standard. The second most important thing, or I guess the equally most important thing, is the open APIs. Another one is open data. So, for example, Wikipedia, the data itself is available under a Creative Commons license, which means you can take it and start up your own Wikipedia if you want. And then, of course, open source. Using the Wikipedia example again, they use the open source MediaWiki software. So all in all, they are actually free cloud because they've got open formats, open APIs, open source, and open data. So what do we mean by open standard? Now, if you look at open standards in Wikipedia, there's a dozen different definitions from people like the EU, Microsoft, and various other reasonably clever individuals. So we've taken basically the best bits of all of this and the most important parts, and we've also tried to make it so that this can be very easily applied as a test. We don't want any kind of open-ended or subjective tests. So the standard must be documented in all its details, published, and both accessible and reusable free of charge. So that's pretty obvious. Standards traditionally you used to have to pay for, and then you may have also had to pay again in order to actually use them and implement them. Patents. Any patents possibly present on parts of this standard must be irrevocably made available on a royalty-free basis. So this is royalty-free as opposed to RAND. So there's no provision there for patent payments whatsoever with Open Cloud, and I think that's reasonably sensible. That was something that people were quite concerned about, especially the open source contingent. Trademarks. Any trademarks possibly present can only be used in a non-discriminatory manner for enforcing compliance. So, for example, if you were to create an Amazon EC2 implementation today, you would run into trouble because the spec is copyrighted. There's patents which are present on at least parts of it, certainly the S3 side of things. And then, of course, if you released a product and started calling it Amazon EC2, then you'd have trademark problems as well. And finally, there must be multiple full, faithful and interoperable implementations for both clients and servers where appropriate, and at least one of the implementation must be licensed under an OSI approved license. So basically we're saying that there's no point releasing thousands and thousands of pages of specification, calling it open when it's not really open. So OOXML would be the example that I'd use there as something we're trying to avoid. I think it'll be a while before we see an open source implementation of OOXML. So, Open Cloud, what is it? The two key requirements are simply open formats and open APIs. So all pertinent functionality must be exposed by way of open standard APIs, and all user data and metadata must be represented in open data formats. So there's absolutely no point having unfettered access to data that you can't read, and there's also no point having no access to transparent data. This targets all cloud computing products, and it allows you to actually keep your secret source. Then we've got Open Source Cloud, which we ran over before. This brings in the base requirements, but adds that the software itself must be available under an open source license. It allows the users to take the software and run it elsewhere on another cloud or internally, and it targets products like Eucalyptus and Hadoop. Open Data Cloud is the same base requirements for Open Cloud, but it also adds that the data itself must be made available under an open knowledge license like Creative Commons or released into the public domain. Wikipedia is one example, Identica is another. It gives the users the freedom to reuse or take the data with them. OpenStreetMap is a good example there. And then so free cloud is all of this together. It's the maximum amount of freedom you can get, and examples include Wikipedia, and then you've got Identica, which is based on this status.net open source software. So the big news today is that we've spent 6 months getting these open cloud principles refined, and that we're actually announcing them today. So they're now available for people to use and to start looking at their products and assessing whether or not they'd be applicable. If they think they are, then certainly come and talk to us about using the logos and so on. And the next steps, I'll finish up quickly so that you can get on with the beers. Get involved in the discussions. Get the word out. If you've got a blog, then blog about it. If you've got a Twitter account, then tweet about it. We'll use the #OpenCloud hashtag. And if you've got a voice, then talk about it. And of course, if you've got a product or service, then submit it for us to have a look at. If you've got any comments, questions, or concerns about it, then please contact me. There's some contact details there. And also a quick shameless plug for the Open Cloud Computing Interface, which will be launched next month. I think next month will be a big month for Open Cloud. Okay.
Thanks, Sam.